Hello and welcome. Thanks for spending part of your day with Lightspeed. We'll be exploring JIRA dashboards and reports. If I could have a brave soul type into the question box and say where you're from, just so I know that we're not just going to be talking to ourselves today. So I'll give you a couple seconds and wait for that, see where people are coming in from. Thank you, Houston, Texas. We got one. So we're at least talking to one person today, Lisa and Roland. That'd be good.
Awesome.
Oh, and Gustavo from Florida,
Nice.
welcome. Charlotte, Brian. Oh, and some neighbors in Herndon and Reston. Buffalo, New York, Arlington. Great. Okay, so we've got a few at least, but they're rolling in and we'll just get started so we're on time here. I'm Audrey and I'll be monitoring your questions over on the sidebar. We just practiced that, so keep them coming. This is going to be a pretty conversational webinar, so go ahead and ask anything you need to ask and we'll get it over to Lisa. And you will receive an email with a link to this recording, slide deck, and information on claiming those continuing education PDUs and SEUs after we finish. And if you look down in the handouts area, you can download the slides right now. We have Lisa, hi Lisa, and Roland in the presenter seats today. Agile Sherpa Lisa Mabli has served as an Agile mentor, coach, and confidant at all organizational levels and in a variety of contexts, including e-com, hospitality, event management, fintech, and internal-facing applications. Connect with Lisa on LinkedIn. You'll see her link later for that. She'd love to hear your thoughts on this presentation and also answer any other questions that come up about it. And Lisa will be joined today by Roland Cuellar, who has focused exclusively on Agile software development and lean business process improvement for nearly 15 years. Maybe more now. That might have been an old bio, Roland.
Yeah, I like
He's
that.
worked with Capital One, CNBC, Westinghouse Nuclear, Nationwide Insurance, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the U.S. courts, and many, many other clients on enterprise adoption. All right, now that my reading practice is over, I think we're ready to get started. And so take it away, Lisa.
Great. Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here. Happy to be joined by everybody who is on here. It looks like the numbers are going up, which is awesome. So we are just going to go ahead and get started. If I can get my slides to advance. Yay! Okay, so I should start off by saying I am not affiliated with Atlassian in any way, shape, or form. Lightspeed is not an Atlassian partner. I've just got some experience working with JIRA and wanted to share that experience with you guys today. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. I've been using JIRA as a PO and a Scrum Master, Agile Coach, consultant for about 6 years now. And there's just a couple of great little reports and dashboards that I thought I would share with you guys. So with that, we'll get started. You guys can see me. I can't see you, so I apologize for that, but I will do my best here. A little bit about me. I love dogs. These are my four. I love to read. This is the book I'm currently reading now. I do a little bit of yoga. I do a little bit of ink and pencil drawing, but most of all, I'm a huge fan of pancakes. So that is definitely the way to my heart. So if you'd like to, as Audrey said, connect with me on LinkedIn, there's my profile down there at the bottom of the slide. So we will take it away. Today we're going to be talking about JIRA reports and dashboards. This is really the beginner level, so if you're an advanced JIRA reporting and dashboarding person, it's great to have you here because you'll ask really good questions, and we'll have a lot of time at the end to go through some general questions or even more specific questions about how you can get reports to answer your specific needs. This audience, I mean, this is designed basically for anybody who's using JIRA, whether you're using it as Kanban or if you're on a Scrum team. It's geared towards especially Scrum Masters and POs and anybody who needs visibility into what's going on with your JIRA data. And fundamentally, at the end of it, you should be able to access your JIRA reports, access your JIRA dashboards, and be able to understand what those reports are trying to tell you and understand what kinds of questions that they're asking. Any questions about that so far? And I will, during the course of this, feel free as I'm talking to put your questions in the chat or in the question box. And that way, at the end of each section, I'll just ask if there are any questions, and then you guys can just let me know what questions have come through, and we can answer them as we go. So feel free to enter those as we're talking. So any questions so far?
Yes, Lisa, it looks like we're already trying to connect with you on LinkedIn and it says we need your email address to connect with you. So that is a trick.
Good question. Okay, so you can, I will give you my email address then. It should be lisa.mabli, so lisa.mabli at gmail.com. If that doesn't work, I'll go
Add
change
it
my
into the chat. All
Yeah, if that
right.
doesn't work, I'll go change my LinkedIn preferences. Sorry about that.
Okay, and we wanted to hit a poll right now to see what our audience looks like right now, right? So
Yes.
we will launch that poll. So what is your role? Are you a Scrum Master, Dev team member, PO, manager, or other / stakeholder? And if it is other, after we do the poll, you can go ahead and chat it into us so we can read out the people who don't fit into the mold here. Okay, so a couple of seconds here. We're almost to 75% voted. And we'll close it there. So here are who's watching today. About 30% Scrum Master, 30% Manager, and a smattering of the rest. And then we'll see, we also have PM, Transformation Leader, Agile Coach, PM, VMO or equivalent, and Transformation Consultant.
Great.
Okay.
That's awesome. What a great group. Well, welcome, everybody. I can't wait to hear your questions at the end for all those specific roles. All right, here we go. Let's get started again. All right, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is reports. We're going to talk through 3 different reports that JIRA provides: the sprint report, the velocity chart, and the fixed version report. And then I'll give a high level on some of the other reports that you might find interesting. And then another thing that we're going to talk about in that section is a little metric that you can get out of the velocity chart that I think is super helpful for the teams, especially in their transformation process, and if they're really focused on doing agile adoption or being transparent and inspecting and adapting. It really, really, really helps teams gain a lot of visibility in what's going on all the way upstream. After we get done with the reporting section, we'll move on to the dashboard section. So I'll just give you a quick intro to some of the gadgets and talk through some of my favorite gadgets that I use. And then we'll go through a couple of sample dashboards, either for teams or for multiple teams, program level overview, and then kind of a dashboard that you could do to track items that have come out of your retrospectives. Really, this entire presentation portion of this is about a half-hour long without questions in the middle of it. So the rest of the time that we have here, it's really going to be an open forum to answer any other questions that you might have. We have Roland on the line to answer questions as well. And then we can go through your own specific reporting needs if you like. So here we go with JIRA reports. Really, when you're talking about reporting, the value of the report really lies in the question that you're trying to ask. And of course, your data needs to be good as well. But really, what JIRA can help you understand is a lot more about your productivity, your predictability, your schedule, your scope, your quality, your flow. So all of these questions, I don't know, this isn't a poll, but I'm sure a lot of you out there have had these questions about what's going on with your teams, where they've come up in retrospective or daily stand-up. And there are some really great reports in JIRA that can help you answer these questions, like, are we meeting our sprint goals? What kinds of work are we completing? Do we have bottlenecks? Are we managing our work in progress? Is our backlog growing? Is our bug backlog growing? Are we keeping up with our bug backlog? So all of those things are super valuable pieces of information, but it's also really important to remember that every team and every project and every organization is going to have a different set of reporting needs because they're going to be addressing different questions. And those are going to change over time as well. This month, you might be trying to answer questions about one thing, and that's going to change next month too. So it's really no one report is a one size fits all for everybody. You just have to pick and choose the ones that are best fit to the questions that you need answered.
Hey, Lisa, can I add something to that?
Yeah.
So I remember working with Mark Schwartz, who was CIO at Citizenship and Immigration Services within the Department of Homeland Security years ago. And he was a master at changing what we measure to drive the behaviors that are going to improve whatever problems we're having at the moment. So, the point of that being not to stick with one set of metrics and measure the same thing forever and ever. For instance, when we were first getting the Agile thing going at Citizenship and Immigration Services, one of the problems that we have, and a lot of teams have when they're first starting off, is WIP management, just trying to do too much. So the really first set of metrics and reports that he focused on was getting WIP under control and making it go down, like cutting it in half for just about everybody, and kind of reporting on that. And after several months of that and getting the teams to get their WIP down, then we could start turning our attention to flow, right, and predictability. And so we start then changing the measurements and the reporting around those things. So it's just an idea to focus on the problems that you have, pick a few metrics that will drive that behavior you want to see, and then new problems will arise, and then you can turn your metrics and reporting towards those. That's it. Thanks.
Yep, you bet. No, that's awesome. Thank you, Roland. So JIRA reports are really easy to access. One thing to note, though, is that when you get into the JIRA reporting area, the reports are going to be driven by the data for whatever board you are on when you click that icon on the left. So if you're on board A, anytime you run a report, it's going to be consuming the data that is on your board. And you may or may not know, but boards are driven by filters. So if you are filtering out data in order to generate this board, just be aware that when you run the report, when you're on that board, you're going to be filtering out that data, so it's not going to show up on that report oftentimes. So just be aware that that is going to be a piece of it. If things are looking a little weird, just go in and make sure that you're actually picking up all the data that you want and you're on the board that you need to be on. So this is the older JIRA UI. Most people have this. I don't have any screenshots of the new UI, but over here on the left, this little stair step thing is a bar chart, and that is what you click in order to get to the reporting module in JIRA. This is just a screenshot of the upper left-hand corner. There are way more than 2 reports in there. There's a couple of dozen, but this is just to show you how to get there. The 3 that I use the most are the sprint report, the velocity chart, and the version report. And then we're going to go into the details of each one of those guys. The reason we're focusing on those 3 is because for me, those are reports that you can use every day, and they're the most valuable to the Scrum teams. There are tons of other reports, as Roland said. You have other things that you need to be looking at on a programmatic level, maybe, that you can also use. But these for day-to-day, kind of just supporting your Scrum team, these are the 3 that are my favorites. Any questions so far? I'll give you guys a second just to make sure.
We do have one. What are your thoughts on the ability to have multiple sprints active at any time?
In what context? Meaning for
right.
Yeah,
we'll get back and add a little bit more context on that question, and we'll come back and revisit.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, cool. So first, we're going to talk through the sprint report. I know a lot of people in stand-up use the Scrum board with the cards and sort of see how they move through the process, but I actually kind of prefer using a sprint report. And here's why. It really gives you great visibility into your sprint progress. There has been a movement recently to move away from the burndown, which is the red line here, which is showing how work is being completed in the sprint. And that's because people were becoming very obsessed with burning down versus just thinking through the process. But the reason I still love the burn down is because it just makes it so much easier to visualize how you're doing relative to where you are in the sprint. That little gray line indicates, if you were to, in a perfect world, if you were just to follow this gray line, you would finish everything that you have in your sprint. So every single day, if you're looking at this and you're noticing that you're 3/4 of the way through your sprint and your red line is still horizontal, which I'm sure none of you have ever experienced in your lives, you've never seen your line go up, you've never seen it be horizontal, but it just gives you a sense of like, what are these conversations that we're going to have? What is happening that is causing us not to be on track for finishing everything that we've committed to this sprint? It also gives you great view into what the sprint dynamics are in a way that sprint board does not. This little report down here on the bottom half of the page, it shows you your list of completed issues and your incompleted issues, or your not completed issues. And there's a little asterisk on the ones that have been added to the sprint. And so that gives you very valuable information on a day-to-day basis about whether the scope is changing for your sprint. And it's kind of hard to see that on either the backlog view or your sprint board. The other nice thing it gives you is your priorities. So if you see a whole bunch of completed issues up that are minor or very low priority, and then you have a whole bunch of really high priority stuff in the incompleted issues list that really encourages those conversations about, are we working on the right things in the right order during this sprint? So there's a couple of little things in this report that I really love. You can use this on a day-to-day basis, and I personally think it's awesome. Then you can, if you need to, you can drill down into these, or you can go back to your sprint board to get a better sense of what's going on there in that view. But I really prefer actually just using this report as you go. You can also use it in retrospective. So once your sprint is over, if you have wound up rolling a bunch of stuff over, you can see what those incomplete issues are, and you can drill down into those. And again, you can talk through, well, what happened at the beginning of the sprint, or why was there a vertical line somewhere halfway through the sprint, what was going on there. So it really just helps you visualize the dynamic in order to answer those kinds of questions better. And again, this is to support the micro-planning that should be happening in daily stand-up. I know we've all been in stand-ups where it's kind of this zombification of, here's the number that I was working on yesterday, here's the number I'm working on today. Again, I'm sure none of you have ever experienced anything like that, but this is a great way to get out of that mode and to get into actually looking what the progress of the sprint is. And it takes the onus off of the individual and what the individual is working on, and it shifts the responsibility of the progress of the sprint to the team, because you're not looking at what an individual is doing. The individuals are still letting you know what they're up to and what their blockers are, but you can see how as a team you can talk together and see how you're going to move your sprint forward. The other thing that you can do is use this in retrospective, as I said. What were these scope changes? Were they healthy scope changes? Were they unhealthy scope changes? Did we balance them out? Did we pull in a bunch of stories into the sprint that were unestimated? If so, why? Did we work on the higher priority stuff first, or is it the high priority stuff that wound up rolling over? And, you know, again, the major thing that you often see happening here is you've got this nice horizontal line, and then at the end you have this major drop off, and usually that means you're just handing everything over to QA at the very end of the sprint. So if you see that happening, then that triggers yet another conversation about how are we going to start handing over stuff a little more incrementally to QA. That was that one. Okay, so questions?
Yes, we'd like to revisit your slide with the 3 favorite reports, just to take another look. Okay. So just a couple seconds here while we do that. And then extra context on the earlier question, Megan said that she is able to turn on her microphone. So would you like to chat through that question later, or maybe save it for the open forum at the end? Or now or at the end? I think maybe we can try turning on mics at the end so it's pretty conversational.
Okay, let's do that.
Yeah. Okay, so that's all the questions for now.
Great. The next one that I love, particularly for Scrum teams, is the velocity chart. And there's lots of reasons that I love this velocity chart. It's great for Scrum Masters. This little report lets you see what you're planning in your sprint versus what you actually deliver. So the gray bar is what you plan. That's your story points that you plan for the sprint. And the green bar lets you know how many story points you have actually delivered. And it gives you historically, so this is 6 or 7 sprints. Then that data is represented again at the bottom. And I like to use this data in sprint planning when you're trying to get a sense of what the volume of work is that you might be able to accomplish in your upcoming sprint. I like to use a 3 to 5 sprint running average. So if we're in sprint 10, use the past 5, which would have been a different 5 than if we had been in sprint 7 or 3 or whichever it is. The more variable your sprints are, so if one sprint you're completing 10 story points, the next sprint you're completing 50, the longer that stretch you want it to be. If you're always around 30 story points and it's, you know, you're never more than 33, you're never less than 27, then you can probably use 3. So the more variability you have, use more, because that will kind of tend to even out some of the odd fluctuations that you might be having from sprint to sprint. But that gives you a good sense of how many story points you can plan for your upcoming sprint. Again, a great one to use during retrospective as well, because it helps trigger those conversations about what were we committing to, and why didn't we deliver, or why did we over deliver, and that's a great conversation to have as well. So reasons I love this report, it really gives you a good reality check for sprint planning. I'm sure none of you have ever seen the situation either where your teams consistently plan for 70 story points and you never finish more than 30. In every sprint, there's 70 in the plan and 30 get finished, 70 in the plan. So this kind of helps visualize, again, are we under committing or over committing? Or, maybe we should just try to commit to 30 and do 30 rather than committing to 70. So those bars kind of just bring it all into perspective for you. It also reduces the risk and the uncertainty there if you're very good on target that way. Again, in retrospective, it triggers some really great conversations about the quality of your estimates, how your flow is doing, the impact of sprint interrupts. And, if you're watching that little green bar go up, you can actually see in a really great way that your team is getting more and more efficient and able to deliver more and more. And then on top of that, it also provides a super useful little metric. So before we go into the metric, I'm going to pause and see if we have any questions.
We do. How do you get a release level burn down chart in terms of open stories or open bugs?
Okay, so that is actually another report. There is actually we do have a release burn down or fixed version burn down in JIRA. That's a completely separate report. So yeah, there is actually a report for doing that. And that's listed on the landing page for the reporting.
Got it. And is there a way to distinguish which completed stories are planned versus unplanned in the velocity chart, i.e. having 2 colors on the green bar instead of just 1? This is often super useful.
Yeah, exactly. I wish they did do that. So, and the nature of this question is, you might have finished, all this is showing you is your story points planned versus story points completed. So it's not showing you, we planned for these 10 stories, which was 100 story points, but we wound up finishing these 5 stories, which weren't even in the original plan. So you still got your 50 story points that you finished, but none of the ones that you finished were actually the original ones that you planned. You can get at that a little bit if you go into the sprint report and then look at the completed issues. You can see which ones were added and the incomplete issues as well. So you at least get a sense from that report which ones were originally in there and whether they were completed or not. So that would require sort of putting the data together for both of those in a manual way.
All right. And this might have been the report before this one. What's the best way to track tasks added in for this sprint report?
The best way to track tasks that are added in? I'm not sure what you mean by that one. They will, as soon as you add them to the sprint, they're going to become part of the sprint report, and then they're just going to show up as a little asterisk on there. If you're adding subtasks, so you've got stories and tasks that are at one part of the hierarchy, their children, the subtasks, if you add those don't feed into the sprint report. You can add as many subtasks as you want, and it doesn't show up anywhere. I don't know if that answers your question, but maybe we can come back to that one at the end as well.
Yeah, any more context that you should stick it in. And we'll take one more question right now. What are some common reasons a team would consistently overcommit?
Enthusiasm. I think.
Pressure.
What's that, Roland?
Pressure.
Or pressure, yeah. I think a lot of times it just comes from, and from what I've experienced, it's this desire to just give everybody everything that they're asking for and to really just want to complete the stuff, right? So I think we've all been in a planning where it's like, or they're getting pressure from a PO, we really need this by the end of the sprint. And so it's kind of like, okay, well, we'll put it all in the sprint. And it really, I think, just comes from a very good place of really just wanting to deliver exactly what the business is asking for, even if it's not reasonable.
Yeah. And if I could add, Lisa, the overcommitment might actually be, that's one way of looking at the problem. Another way of looking at the problem is that we consistently underestimate what we can get done. It may be more of an estimation issue than a commitment issue. And that may take some time for the team to learn how to better estimate and to actually use this data that we get from these reports to improve our estimation and at least realize that we are consistently underestimated. And sometimes those estimates too are driven by external dependencies and external partners where you're waiting on people, and those figure into the estimation as well. Like, it may not be a lot of work for us, but if we spend half the sprint waiting on other people to do stuff, we miss our dates, even though we actually had plenty of hours to do stuff. So there's a lot packed into that question, I think.
And we've got some context on the adding tasks in question. So yes, subtasks. Is there a way to track that? Or should we suggest to add tasks instead of subtasks to measure them?
I think it depends on what you want to measure and why you want to measure them. For me, usually I use subtasks as just part of the to-do list in order to get that story or whatever it is done. So for me, if you're really using it in that way, of just update the model, update the viewer, update the controller, or write your unit test. If you're using them that way, I'd be curious to see what the value is in understanding what those kinds of tasks are. If you're using tasks that are kind of really whole bodies of work in themselves, that to me would signal that maybe those do need to be at the task or a higher level and not listed as subtasks. Because if you've got a bunch of large chunks of work that are being listed as subtasks on a story, that to me is always kind of a red flag that maybe your story is too large and these subtasks actually need to be tasks and bumped up a level in the hierarchy.
All right, and then a comment.
I'm not sure about that. Please, if I haven't answered your question, by all means, please just let me know.
We do have a comment on the overcommitting question, which was product owner and scrum master need to control WIP to get more realistic results.
Absolutely, amen.
All right, okay, let's keep rolling.
So kind of going back to what Roland was talking about, there are lots and lots and lots of reasons why your plan does not match your delivery. And that could be because you're over or underestimating, but there are some really great ways to get at what might be happening. And so this is the little bonus metric that I was talking about. I don't want anybody to get freaked out about, the fact that I'm using the word metric. I mean this in the most positive, beautiful, wonderful, supportive way. But there is a little metric that you can get out of the velocity chart that really helps the teams. And I want you guys to look at these and just sort of in your brain, if you're a stakeholder and you've got team A and you've got team B, and team A says, we're going to deliver this body of work in the next 3 weeks, and team B says, we're going to deliver this body of work in the next 3 weeks, which team feels like it's probably actually going to do that? So I'll answer that for you. It's totally rhetorical. Usually people feel a little more confident in what team B is telling them, and there's a reason for that. There's an intuition behind that, and that is this: the fact that what you say you're going to deliver is what you actually deliver. So there's a great little metric that you can pull out of this chart, and you can call it whatever you want to: sprint completion percentage, whatever, commitment percentage, however you want to phrase it that makes sense for your organization. And that is really just the ratio of the stuff you deliver to the stuff you have planned. And when I say stuff, if you're not using story points, you can do a count. If you're using story points, use story points. It's whatever makes sense for you guys. The idea here is that you can view actually kind of what's happening all the way upstream when you look at this ratio. If you are consistently over or under delivering, that drives these conversations about, well, why is that? Is it an issue with sprint planning? Okay, as Roland said, maybe we don't understand our velocity. Well, why don't we understand our velocity? Maybe it's because our estimates aren't that great. Well, why aren't our estimates that great? Well, maybe it's because we don't have really great stories. Well, maybe we don't really have great stories because we don't really have great requirements to begin with. So if you're seeing this constant overcommitment, there's all kinds of ways that you can start asking these questions and digging in and scraping back and finding out what is actually the root cause of what's going on. So tracking that little metric is really fantastic for teams because it really puts all of these things into relief, and it really drives process improvements all the way back to the quality of the requirements that you get. And the reason I love this is because when you guys are looking at team A versus team B, it's really obvious that you're going to feel more confident believing what team B tells you about what they're going to deliver because they're consistently delivering what they say they're going to deliver. And that really lets you feel a lot more confident in your estimates of progress on your projects. It provides this really great foundation of trust with your stakeholders. And it also lets you see, how we're doing on all these process improvements all the way upstream, where if those are all getting better, you're just naturally going to see that ratio getting better to where you're actually delivering on what you say you're going to deliver on. So that's my that's why I love that report and that little metric that comes out of it. So open to questions on that one.
All right, a couple of thoughts here. First, Roland, you mentioned that you use the scrum methodology. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah.
And then second, what are some examples of how you use it?
Okay.
We're asking, why have tasks? Why not just use stories? How do you explain the difference to teams? Seems redundant.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's probably as many answers as there are Agile consultants on the planet. The way I like to think of them is that a story usually takes more than one person, and and it can be divided into subtasks. A task can be something that just one person can do. One person you may only have one person working on the story, but the point is that a story could be worked on by multiple people if needed. And then a task is usually just kind of a smaller thing. It usually doesn't have subtasks necessarily, and it's kind of a thing that you have to write a script or something like that. So it's a slightly different difference between the two. I don't know, Roland, have you?
Yep.
That's usually how I kind of divide them up, is sort of
Yeah.
user facing.
The question here is why. I think if I've got new teams or people or teams that have been around for a while, but they're working on a new application or something they're not real familiar with, we might need to sit down and think about all the things that we need to do. We make sure that we update the database, and we need to make sure we update this script. And it's almost like a to-do list to make sure you don't forget anything. And so when I've got teams that are new together, or they're working on new parts of the applications that they're not familiar with, sometimes I'll ask them to put together tasks to make sure we don't forget about stuff. If I've got mature teams that have been working in an application area for a while, and they know this stuff like the back of their hands, I usually don't even ask people to create tasks at all. Like, you know what to get done. We just need to make sure that we get this user story done. And so those are a couple of reasons for using tasks. I find there's some reasons for using tasks that I don't like as much. And where I don't like it as much for me personally is when we start to try to estimate every conceivable task that needs to get done in order to get a user story done, try to estimate how many hours that it is. And we're doing lots of estimation around hours. And then we're starting looking at all our skills and capabilities on the team and trying to make sure that we have all the hours that we get covered. And it's going to a level of planning and detail that I think it oftentimes doesn't work. Like, it seems like it should, but it doesn't, because we're not very good at estimating hours. We suck at it, actually. And so it oftentimes doesn't end up playing out. And the other reason I don't like tasks so much is when we use it to break the team apart. Okay, like I have this story to do. It has 10 tasks associated with it, and I'm going to divvy those tasks out to everybody and have everyone go off and do their task. And that's kind of a way of separating people out, as opposed to, hey, who are the 3 people that I need to get this user story done? Can you folks all sit around together, get your laptops together, and work on it together as a group? And having the work be higher level and bringing people together as opposed to separating them out with tasks is what I personally prefer. But I can see that there are reasons why you might think that you need to use tasks in certain situations, but I tend to not use them for the most part.
So, and also let me, just from a nomenclature perspective, let's also be clear too. Roland, I think you were talking about subtasks as they're represented here, right? So there are tasks that are at the same level of the hierarchy as stories. And what Roland was just talking about is the subtasks, which are the children of that hierarchy level. And so I was responding to the tasks and the task and story level, and I think Roland was responding to the using subtasks on either one of those guys as well.
Yeah, thank you. Good clarification.
Any other questions on this?
We do. Are there reports to track the number of success criteria that were successfully demonstrated to stakeholders?
There are not, to my knowledge. I think the best way to look at what was successful is what's in done. So if your definition of done includes the fact that this thing has been tested and has met all of its acceptance criteria, then just being in done would be your indication of that. And you can actually run a filter on that stuff as well.
Yeah, one could, I think, getting back to the tasks, set up testing. You could put testing subtasks under the story, and then as different ones are completed and approved, you could call those complete, and then you'd know which of the testing subtasks were completed and which ones were not. That would
Yeah,
be
and that's super common too for people to put testing tasks as, and you might have different environments that you have to test in, or you can break out subtasks all the way from writing the test cases, doing your unit testing, and then writing your test cases, writing your automated test cases, and doing the testing in whatever environment, and then environment two. So yeah, that subtasks are a great way to do that. So yeah, that's a great point, Roland. And that's a super common way to use them. I think that would be even acceptable to Roland to use subtests that way.
Yes, I agree.
Okay.
Lisa, is that velocity chart ration only available in JIRA's cloud offering, or is it also available on the premium version?
You, no matter whether if you're on the cloud or not, you should have the velocity chart available to you. Yeah, the little ratio that's calculated there is not in JIRA anywhere. So what I've done here is literally copy the data down at the bottom, copy that table and paste it into Excel, and then do the little formula off on the right-hand side. So that doesn't exist in JIRA anywhere. But the velocity chart that has the bars and the data underneath it, that's what exists in should be all versions of JIRA.
Great. Okay, we've got a lot of questions piled up, but I'm wondering if you want to keep moving ahead and we'll save it all for the open chat.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's do that. Okay. So moving on to the fixed version report, this is the third one that I love to look at all the time. A lot of people don't even know that this thing exists in JIRA, or how valuable it is, or how to actually make it valuable. So this is a fantastic report for understanding what is in a release and what your delivery timeline is likely going to look like. I love this approach because it gives you sort of a time frame versus we are going to deliver this scope on this date, which you and I both know never happens. So this is a great way to look at what the range is likely to be given the situation that we're in now, and assuming that's going to keep going into the future. So there's a lot of stuff built in there, but it's a lot less project management-y and a lot more agile-y to have a sense of where things are most likely to fall. So this is great for project and program managers and stakeholders as well, because you can just sort of track the progress of a fixed version as you go. The thing that it requires are the use of the fixed version field. It does need to have estimates on most of the stuff, and things need to be put in the correct status when it's done, put it in done. So if your team's a little lax about moving things through the workflow, this report isn't going to be as valuable. So a couple of things to notice here. The blue line is actually the progress that the team is making on this fixed version. So it is a day-to-day, how many stories are you completing, and that is determining the velocity for this fixed version. So if you're working on version 2.1 and a couple of things from 2.2 and a couple of things from 2.3, then this report, if you're doing the version report for 2.1, is only going to show you the progress for 2.1. So it's a little different than your sprint velocity, because this is honed in on what that fixed version label is. So that's the blue stuff. That's showing you what's completed, and the blue line is based on that daily velocity for the items in this fixed version, and it's projected out. Where that line crosses the top of the gray area is what the projected delivery date range is going to be, and that's kind of like worst to best case scenario. And here's the super important thing. It is giving you the timeline based on the scope of the estimated stories in your backlog. So if most of your fixed version stories are not estimated, obviously this is going to be a little on the shy side. The red line that's on here is showing you what percentage of the stories that are labeled with a fixed version are estimated. So if that red line is super low, you can be pretty confident and you can extrapolate a little bit on the dates that this is giving you. If that red line is super high, where most of your stuff isn't estimated, then you have a lot less confidence in this, in what the delivery date range is going to be. So this is fantastic. I love this report because it really does give you a better sense of, it incorporates risk into what your delivery timeline is going to be, which a lot of places don't use. It lets you see what the scope changes are. You guys can see here that the scope on this release has changed as that gray area is increasing the top line of there. It lets you know what your uncertainty is, as you get more and more things estimated and you get your team's velocity towards a fixed version starts to stabilize, that blue range actually kind of narrows. So this is good to check up on every week or at the end of every sprint just to see that those dates are still on track. The really great thing about this is that you can start having conversations early rather than late when you're about to miss your delivery. And of course, we've never been on a team that's missed a delivery timeline. But should you find yourself in that position, it's a lot better to know in June that you're going to miss your August delivery date than in August to realize that you're going to miss your August delivery date. So this is really fantastic for having those early conversations about what, do we have to, decrease scope? Do we need to add a team, or just having those conversations about what might actually help keep this on track? Or, hey, maybe we're going to be delivering this early and we can add scope. The key thing here is that the fixed version field, I've seen the fixed version field used in just 57 different ways, but really the fixed version field, in order to, if you want to utilize this report, you need to think of it as like a target version. So here's all the stuff that we want to put into this release. So it's kind of your target release. And then you also need to keep the statuses up to date, because that's what's driving the daily velocity. That's kind of driving the slope of that line. And then also keeping on top of your estimate. So the larger chunk of that version that you have estimated, the better. Any
hey,
questions?
Lisa, can I add? Oh
yeah.
yeah, I was going to add a couple of things. So
yes.
There was a question earlier about a release burn down chart.
Uh-huh.
And this is sort of JIRA's answer to that, except it's completely opposite. So the thing is that JIRA doesn't call things releases so much as they call them versions. So if you're looking for a release burn down or release report, when you go into JIRA, you're going to look at version report, right? That's the word that they use. And then the other thing is that they don't really do, at this level, at the release level or the version level, they don't do burn down, they sort of do a burn up. This is what this is. And so what you do in JIRA is that you go in and say, hey, we want to have the 2.0 release of our product or whatever it's going to be. And you set up a version in JIRA for that. And then you add scope items, backlog items to that. Say, hey, this scope item is part of our target 2.0 release. And then you also give a target date, a date that you'd like to ship this release by. And now it's going to do all the calculations to show you, how close, how on track are you to hitting the date that you put out there. And so I think that's kind of how this works, more or less. Is that right, Lisa?
Yeah, that's right. And then that's a great point, Roland. This one, clearly on this fixed version, there's not a target delivery date. If there had been, there would have been a vertical dotted line showing you what you have put into the release page into that module on JIRA.
Yep. And tacking on to Roland's thoughts, we've got a question. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say there is actually I don't like it as well because it's a little hard to get your head around, and it's just not as visually successful, I think, as this report. But there is a fixed version burn down, and I think they do actually call it a release burn down, and it's kind of a bar chart, and it's offset, and it's yeah, it's a little weird. They have the same thing for epics, and some people do like that report. It's just not my favorite. I much prefer to see it in this.
Yeah, I find that one hard to read too. I've never really understood how it works. Yep.
Be curious how many people use that one on a regular basis. So Audrey, you said you had another question?
We do. We have someone wondering if this report is similar to a product burn up chart.
Yeah, probably. I mean, it sounds like that's pretty much what this is. It is showing you what how you're burning up. This is just like your sprint burn down. Your burn up there is your blue line, and then your target is your gray, the height of your gray line there. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm pointing at my screen. Obviously, you guys can see that as I'm pointing at my screen.
Patrick has a comment. He says, I presume you can essentially name a fixed version the same as an epic if you want to know when an epic is forecasting a completion date.
Yeah, let's hold the discussion for epics and fixed versions till later, because that's a huge the way I wouldn't recommend doing that way, and I have a whole lot of reasons for doing that, but I'd like to kind of tack that on to the end if we have time to do that, if that's okay. Or we can, if you'd like, again, as we mentioned before, connect with me on LinkedIn, and then we can have that conversation there as well. But yeah.
Sure, and a couple of questions specific to this report, and then we can open that conversation. So if you have multiple deployments a day to deliver incrementally, how do you manage the fixed versions with respect to the delivered cards as well as use this report?
So usually when people are doing their incremental delivery, it's more like a small deployment, and it's okay. So let me back up there. This is really when you have a release that's going to be across a larger time frame than your continuous delivery type model. So you might be having those continuous delivery. You might be doing a build every hour or whatever it is. This isn't for that so much. This is more for at the end of the month or your quarterly delivery. You could even use it for your your 2 or 3 week sprint as well, but it's not really designed for that daily really short stuff. I think the overhead of managing that on the release page in that tool in JIRA would just be astronomical. So yeah, you might be doing a bunch of little tiny builds, and you might be doing the continuous delivery towards a final completion of a release that is going out the door, intended to have this functionality out the door by whatever date it is.
Another way I've seen folks think about it is I've got a number of customers who are separating the notion of release from deployment. Okay? Yeah. And so maybe I've got a release 2.0 with my product, and for release 2.0, we want to deliver these, a whole bunch of new capabilities and fixes. But I may be deploying those in an incremental fashion every day or every few days. I put a new fix or a new little bit of capability out there. And this release isn't done until all of those are out there. But in that situation, it's almost the deployment's also like part of the definition of done, of getting a particular piece of work out there. And so you could differentiate between deployments and releases. Yeah, would be another thing to think about. Yeah.
All right, and just one quick one here. What if the release involves tickets in more than one JIRA project?
That's fine. You just have to have it labeled with the fixed version. Oh, you know what? Actually, unless they've changed this, I might be misspeaking here, but you may only be able to run this from a fixed version per project. So if you have multiples, yeah, that's a really great question. I'll have to look into that. I have this kind of vague niggling thing in my head that's saying that if they're in different projects, the fixed versions are actually different. Like you can name them the same thing, but as far as JIRA's database is concerned, those are unique IDs. So you can't run a fixed version report on things in multiple projects. I might be mistaken about that, and JIRA might have done something about that, but that's something I'll have to look into. That's a great question. Yep.
Yeah, there's a new portfolio level reporting capability that can give you some reporting tools across projects, so and some roll up. So there might be some ways to do something with that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, let's keep rolling and get to the chat.
There's a bunch of other JIRA reports out there. The two on the left are the cumulative flow diagram and the control chart come out of operations research. If you have a background or an understanding of those kinds of ways of looking at data, that's super helpful, or if someone on your team does, just to help with the interpretation of those. They are helpful even if you don't have that background. It's just you have to be aware that they do violate some of the mathematical assumptions that are required for true cumulative flow diagrams and control charts. But there is nevertheless information there that is very helpful for understanding what your bottlenecks might be, whether your WIP queues are growing, what your cycle times are. So there's a lot of great info that can be gleaned from there. You just be sure you've done a little research into how those things are usually used and set up so that you can understand the limitations of the data and understand, that what you're looking at is probably not 100% accurate, just because, again, they violate some of the usual assumptions that go into building these things. But it's not to say that they're not helpful, because they really are. There are a couple of other reports, created versus resolved, recently created, and just a basic pie chart. Created versus resolved is awesome because if you base it on a filter for bugs, you can see whether you're keeping up with how many bugs are coming in. If on the recently created one, you can see if you just got this backlog that's blossoming and people are just dumping stuff in there. And then pie charts really are just based on whatever filter you ask it, and then you divide it up however, you sort of specify how you want it divided up. And it can answer great questions like what percentage of our volume of work is going towards bugs or tech debt or stories. What percentage of our overall backlog is bugs? How are we, doing there? So pie charts are another great one too for slicing and dicing your data in whatever way you need to. Roland, do you have anything to add for these guys?
No, these are all, there's a wealth of reporting out there. And, the created versus resolved, I like it. Sort of a basic answer is the question of, is work coming in faster than we can get it done? And our backlog is kind of growing and let you kind of see that. And then there are a wealth of pie charts, as Lisa mentioned, just very, very many pie charts that you can create, which I can find very useful.
Who doesn't like pie charts?
I know.
Okay, so we only have about 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna maybe we can just really these dashboards are super simple. I'm just gonna give you a few examples of what you can use, and then we can open it up to questions after that. Does that sound fair?
Sounds good.
Okay. So JIRA dashboards are great. They're not scary. They're incredibly easy to make, and you should be using them basically. They are found up here on the upper left by the JIRA icon up there. If you click on dashboards, it will bring you to a screen where it says manage dashboards, and you'll see a list of all the dashboards that you have access to if it's been opened up to you. And then they make it very easy by giving you a button that says create new dashboard. So if you click that button, you will be brought to a little pop-up that shows you how to, or that lets you create a new dashboard. You can name it, put a description in there, and share your dashboard. Note on that, some of these gadgets require filters. So if you share your dashboard with a group of people, if that group of people is not also able to view the results of your filter, then they're not going to see any data on the dashboard. So if you're sharing your dashboard and you want those people to see any of the gadgets that have filter results, be sure your filter is also turned on for those people as well. So when you create your dashboard, it'll just open up an empty dashboard, and then there's an add gadget button up there. If you click that, it'll start with just a handful, like maybe 5, and then there's another link that you can hit, and it will populate it with all of the gadgets that are available to you. So these are my favorite 8 gadgets. And these are the 4 that I use all the time. So they're all really great. Filter results is if you find that you are constantly trying to find, go into that menu and drop down and try to find your filters that you use all the time, or go into the filter screen, you can also just create a dashboard that has those results presented for you. Issue statistics, your sprint burn down, your version report, and your sprint health, those are the 4 that I use all the time. The 2-dimensional filter statistics are great. It's just based on whatever filter you want, and you define how you want it on the X and the Y axis, how you want it to slice and dice that data. JIRA roadmap is great. If you're managing your fixed versions in that, the JIRA fixed version, the thing that you get to when you hit that little icon of a ship on the left-hand side, it brings you to a page that has all of your releases on it. If you're managing that, this little gadget can actually show you how you're doing on progress on all of those releases. And then again, the created versus resolved chart is actually ported over into the dashboard. It's one of the few reports that actually just comes over. And then your sprint burn down also is one of the few that comes over. And sprint health is another really great one, and we'll see all of those here in a minute. So this is a great little dashboard for just using in daily stand-up. It's got the sprint health gadget up there in the upper left. In general terms, it tells you your stuff that's in the to-do category, which is blue. It tells you what's in the in progress category, which is yellow, and then it tells you what's in the done category, which is the green bit. So this is telling you that 31% of our time has elapsed and we've only completed 2% of the work. So that's a great conversation starter and stand up about how are we doing on our sprint. It also tells you what your scope change is, and it lets you know if there are any issues that have been flagged. So that's a great heads up for your Scrum Master for roadblock removal. If you then put the sprint burn down on top of that, it kind of helps you see, again, all the reasons that I love the sprint burn down still apply here. And then if your teams happen to be working towards a specific version, you can stick a version report on there, and then they can kind of check on a day-to-day basis You know, have we done something? Are we, you know, are we still tracking on the date that we expected? If you happen to be a Scrum Master for multiple teams, or you happen to have resources shared across teams, you can change the layout on this and have a 3-column layout and do that exact same dashboard, but times 3. The one thing that I've added here is issue statistics, because up at the top in Sprint Health, you have the to-do, in progress, and done categories, but you might not know, well, what do you mean in progress? Is that in dev in progress, or is that in QA in progress? And so if you want to split that up, you can do that down at the bottom based on issue status. And so it'll just pick up all the statuses in your workflow, and it'll show you more specifically what kinds of things are in each of those. Let's ignore the 2,800% scope change up here on the right. I'm sure a few of you noticed that one. And I'm sure none of you have ever seen that happen either. Okay, so again, you know, dashboards typically are best when they're very focused and they've just got a couple of things on there that are very specific to what you're looking for. But sometimes you come out of retro or some other meeting and you have no idea what's going on. Like, we know there's a dynamic that needs to be fixed, but we have no idea what's causing it or what's happening. Then you can actually, it actually helps to do kind of a shotgun approach, where you just start tracking things that you think might be causing whatever's happening, and then just start looking for patterns. And then when it becomes a little more clear that it might be this thing or it might be that thing, start honing in on those specific things. You might find that it's just a data quality issue, like people aren't updating tickets, or you might find that you actually have real bottlenecks, or you might, you know, maybe your workflow in JIRA is not serving your team well because it's not representing what the actual flow of work really looks like, and it's kind of gunking things up. So you can also just take a dashboard for retro and track things that are very specific that you do know the dynamics of, so that in your next retro or the next couple of retros, you can actually track progress on the items that came out of retro that your team has decided to start fixing. So finally, you have kind of the program level dashboard. Again, you've got your JIRA roadmap here, which is feeding off of those the release page. You've got some filter results, and you can have multiple version reports on here. You just have to set it to pick up whichever version, and that way you can track delivery for multiple teams or multiple versions on that. So in sum, very quickly, and then we'll open this up to questions. Use the sprint report, the velocity chart, and the fixed version report to kind of support your teams and all their Scrum ceremonies or Scrum events or whatever you'd like to call them. Really explore how valuable this little story point delivered versus planned metric can be for your teams for driving conversations about improvements all the way upstream. And then create a couple of really uncomplicated dashboards that hone in on what your team is trying to inspect and adapt and monitor. So that's all I've got. So I think we're on to the open forum now. I'm happy to stay. I don't have anything planned. I'm happy to stay as long as you guys are. I think we only have 3 minutes scheduled on the webinar, but we can keep it open. I think, is that okay, Audrey?
Yes, and if anybody has to run, I know we scheduled for an hour, so thank you so much for joining us. Connect with Lisa on LinkedIn or send any other questions to info@lightspeed.com. We will stick around for a while and start answering questions. We also hope you can join us May 15th for our 6th annual Lean plus Agile DC conference and job fair if you're in the DC area. So you can see that at leanagiledc.com. So Lisa, the first question I wanted to open up, Megan at the very beginning had asked a question about having multiple sprints active. And I told her I didn't have the context, so I was hoping I could open up her mic, and she said yes.
Great.
And so let's see if we can make that work right now, Megan. And I've unmuted Megan.
Hi, Megan.
Hi. Hello, how are you?
I'm well.
So, sorry. So I know JIRA recently has added the option to have 2 sprints that are active at the same time. We are currently using them as 1 sprint sort of winds down in the development area, and QA is working. QA is viciously working to get those things tested and debugged. And we, at that point, are starting a 2nd sprint, so the development team doesn't really have a huge lag there. What are your thoughts on that as far as just the planning and release planning and reporting aspect?
So first off, I was not aware that you could start 2 sprints on the same board. I mean, you can have 2 sprints going, but I wasn't aware that you could have two sprints concurrently on the same board in JIRA. So that's new for me. But I can answer the second part of the question, which is having a separate sprint for dev and QA. And honestly, I wouldn't recommend it. So is your question about whether that's a good way to go, or is it that, you know, you've decided to go that way and how do you manage it?
The question is more along having 2 sprints. The velocity looks the same for both of those sprints because you've got all the activities within the sprint. However, they're overlapping, and so it looks like everybody is 100% busy 100% of the time, even though they're not necessarily working in the same sprint. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does make sense.
The reporting aspect of that is going to, I think, look a little bit different, maybe.
Yeah, I think, well, and I think the fact that it just is kind of confusing to explain. It sounds to me like that you know, thinking through about how that's going to look and how that's working actually on the ground as well might also be a little confusing, right? So I don't know how your reporting is going to capture that, because typically, you know, when we're using JIRA to reporting, the assumption is that dev and QA are happening on the same ticket and it's part of the same ticket, and that ticket's not done, and it's the whole team that's responsible for getting that ticket moved to done. So it's all kind of grouped together instead of, you know, siloing between dev and then QA and having it being represented in as different sprints. So my recommendation would be to just, you know, you could use subtasks on a story if you want to track, you know, how far you've gotten on QA, and then, but keep one story that is all of the work for dev and QA, and then just have that be one sprint per team, if that makes sense.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
All right, and we have a comment on that from Jim. He said, I think you can start 2 sprints on the same project separated by JIRA component, for example, or other discernible criteria. Not entirely sure of the mechanics, but I did learn that recently.
Okay, great. Something for me to Google when we're done here. That's awesome.
All right. And so I'll go through a couple quick ones here, I think. What is the exact role for a Scrum Master in JIRA?
The role for a Scrum Master in JIRA?
Mm-hmm.
Can we elaborate more on the context of that? Are you asking more about what the role of a Scrum Master is on a Scrum team, or if there are specific like groups and permissions that can be assigned to Scrum Masters?
Okay, we'll wait on some more context for that one.
That'd be great. Thank you.
And then, are there any suggestions for Kanban boards? Do we need some more context on that one?
Yes. So what we've been talking about so far, and most of this applies if you're doing Kanban as well. Obviously, the sprint report doesn't, but yeah, so Kanban has a slightly different approach to all of these things. So these are really for sprints and Scrum teams, and maybe we should have made that clear at the beginning. Although a lot of these reports and dashboards and things still do apply. It's just not the sprint specific ones. But if you have more context on that, on what specific recommendations about using Kanban boards might be, then that's great. Happy to answer those too.
Okay, and the Scrum Master question was the Scrum Master role in a team. So what I can help with is send some resources on the Scrum Master role. So I'll send those out to you. And so if your teams are dependent on other teams that are not cross-functional, and due to impediments on those teams, is there a report that shows user stories moved due to impediments and measure user stories being added in? I know more Kanban, but to measure impediments.
Yeah, so there's not a specific report that shows that, and I wish there were. The closest thing you can get is if you happen to be in a sprint, you can get that list of stories that were added or removed. So it kind of, that sprint report actually tells you not only what's completed and not completed, but also what was removed from the sprint. So you can kind of understand the dynamic from that, but there's not a real clear report in JIRA that says, you know, this has been removed or is impeded. You can, however, if you can flag things in JIRA. So for example, if you're on the backlog view and you right click on an issue, you have the option of flagging it as blocked, and you can add comments to it as well. JIRA does actually pick up on things that are flagged, and you saw that on the sprint health report where it had like a 4 stories flagged or whatever it was, and you can actually drill into that and see what those impediments are. That's kind of the closest thing that you can get. You can also filter on flagged stories. So if you want to know, you can put a date range in there, and you want to know how many stories were flagged because they were impeded, then you can actually create a filter around that as well, and just pull those up on your own, and then maybe bring that into Excel and do some reporting on your own.
Yeah, I think there's a blocked report, I think. And Lisa, do you remember, does JIRA support tagging? Is that you might be able to put a tag in that says, external dependency, and then run some purchase reports on that.
Yeah,
so
they
just
use
roll
labels.
your own. Yep.
Yep, you can make use of labels for that.
Yep.
Yeah, and the nice thing, if it's in the middle of the sprint and it's blocked, and you flag it that way with the right click on the issue, and you add the flag, it turns bright yellow in the backlog view and on your sprint board view. So that's a great red flag for the Scrum Master to be alerted that, hey, here's a thing that's blocked, and it's something that's been blocked for a while. So yeah, there's a couple of ways to skin that cat, but unfortunately, I don't think JIRA has a straight up, here's your blocked issues from that reporting menu.
All right. Let's see. Do you have suggested KPIs at the program level?
Yeah, without knowing what your program is, no, I don't. That's the funny thing about KPIs is that they are, and I know Roland has some things to say about this, so I'll make it brief because I'm sure he has more to say, but KPIs are always specific to the team or the program because they should be driving changes in behavior that you want to see in order to fix very specific things that you want fixed. So that would really depend on your program and what kind of behavior you're trying to drive there. Yeah, Roland.
I guess if there was one thing, and it's something you mentioned earlier, if there was one thing I was going to focus on, it would be first, it would be predictability.
Yep.
And kind of looking at across the program, I've got all these teams. Are our teams able to reliably predict more or less about how much they can get done in some unit of time? And then focusing our attention and our coaching and training on the teams that are maybe are struggling with their level of predictability, and maybe they need help with requirements and user stories, maybe they need help with estimation, maybe they need help with external dependencies and blockers. But if we can't predict when we're going to deliver stuff, it's going to be very hard for the program overall to hit its milestones, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Some successful KPIs I've seen in the past are, using that sprint commitment and ratio, because again, that goes to predictability. It helps drive a lot of changes upstream, and then that requires a whole bunch of people to be on board. So it's never just this individual is having to be measured for performance. And again, it also depends on whether you're talking about actually using them to measure for performance, or if you're using them just to get a sense of the program view. So that's a good one. Backlog health is another big one. A lot of times the reason that people aren't predictable is because there's not enough estimated queued up stuff ready for them. So they get into sprint planning and they're sort of randomly pulling stuff from the backlog that they've never seen before, and they have to, quickly go through requirements and throw some kind of story point estimate on there. So if you can, I've seen very successful KPIs where you have to have 2 sprints ahead groomed, so that, if you do need to pull in work, it groomed and prioritized. So how big the thing is, and you can just pull it off the top of the list. And then you're sure that you're not starving your dev team for work too. So that's another one, is just being, understanding what your velocity is and having, 2 sprints worth of work with estimates on them and prioritized, just to make sure that you've got all of your requirements. That sort of forces the timeline up a bit for the product part of the team to get requirements in and to get those stories into a grooming session.
All right, so let's see here. A clarification on the Kanban question.
Oh yeah, great.
Do you have any preferred reports that you've used for Kanban boards, like the reports we're walking through for sprints and scrum teams?
Yeah, I don't really. Kanban is such a different beast. There are, you can do the created versus resolved report, and Roland, again, you might have some additional insight into this one. Created versus resolved is good because usually in Kanban you got that really small high turnover type task stuff, and you're just moving stuff through the queue. So that one's probably pretty good about doing it. Again, the sprint report stuff doesn't match, and even your release stuff doesn't match necessarily as well. So I think that would the created versus resolved is probably a good one. If you kind of, JIRA was originally designed as a bug tracking system, so if you kind of think of it in that sense, there's some good reports in there. Yeah. Roland, what do you think?
Yeah, but Kanban is all about continuous flow, and so the flow metrics are the ones that are most natural there. They're just we're so unused to measuring those things, and even the reporting that JIRA has isn't exactly perfect around cumulative flow and control charts and stuff. But those are probably the most appropriate ones. I think it's just a lift for people to understand kind of what they're telling you and how you might use them. For example, but the other thing I would probably look at is some way of measuring WIP and being able to. And that's the real driver of flow, and so it's easy to see WIP buildups in various states of the process or across the board. And of course, that's what the cumulative flow diagram is all about. But learning to interpret the cumulative flow diagram is non-trivial for most people.
And it would also assume that, and hopefully your Kanban issues are not huge. So, if you're doing Kanban, usually the idea is that the stories are a little more uniform and they're a little smaller. They're not these ginormous things that you're just kind of using it as a to-do list, basically. And the smaller, more uniform they are, the more valuable the cumulative flow diagram and the control chart will be.
Absolutely. And that's where the control chart kind of can show you those things. It's hard to juggle BBs and bowling balls at the same time. And the control chart kind of shows you that, man, we've got some stuff that takes us 3 weeks to get done and some stuff that takes us 3 hours to get done. And it's kind of hard to manage, those two kinds of work. So, yeah, I mean, the control chart and the cumulative flow are the main ones that JIRA provides.
What else?
All right. Why do some teams use burn up charts versus burn down? What types of projects or companies necessitate one versus the other?
It's so funny. I think you could probably spend a week or two going through forums on the arguments about burn up versus burn down.
Could that be our next webinar?
Yeah, our next webinar. For me personally, it's really just a matter of preference. JIRA, if you look at some, you can actually set up your burn down chart in JIRA. For example, if you've got hours estimates and you are using the hours estimates in there, it actually does both. It gives you the burn up of hours and the burn down of your hours. So just where they cross hopefully is somewhere that makes sense, somewhere toward the midpoint of your sprint. But it's for me it's just a matter of preference. Some people feel like it's more positive and better for morale to see stuff being burned down than it is to see just feels like a harder climb to burn stuff up. So it's really just a matter of preference, I think. Roland, do you have any strong feelings about that?
Absolutely not. No, they're both two sides of the same coin. It really doesn't matter.
All right. Why does LOE, level of effort, i.e. hours to complete, only used for tasks? Why is it only used for tasks?
That's interesting. That's probably, so JIRA gives you the ability to log your hours either on the story and task level or the subtask level. And that's just a question of whether it's turned on in your JIRA instance, and that's something your JIRA admin does, and then you can record your tasks. So I'm not aware that there's any particular reason other than how it's configured to be turned on for one thing versus another. But I'm pretty sure it's at the project level where the JIRA admin for the project can turn on hours tracking for pretty much anything. You can put hours on anything in there. It just depends on where how they've configured it and whether it shows up on the screen. So JIRA administration is also great fun, but you may have hours turned on, but it may be turned off for the screens that are associated with a particular issue type. So that may be what's going on, but yeah, it's pretty binary. It's either on or off. It's just a question of whether it's made visible for the screens on the issue types that you're talking about.
All right. Okay, and we do have probably 15 questions in here, so we'll answer 2 more, but if we didn't get to your question, please email them to info@lightspeed.com or connect with Lisa on LinkedIn. And we definitely like to get them all answered. We're just running short on time for today. So just a couple more, and then we're going to wrap it up. One is, if I set up a team with individual tasks that are identical for tracking, will these roll up to an Epic view, or do I have to set up each task as a story to each team member to see the roll up at the Epic level?
So the way you roll things into an epic is to label them all with the same epic. So you create the epic first. So you go up to the create menu for in whatever issue type you are, and then you choose epic and you create the epic. And then when you create your task, then there's a field for epic link, hopefully, and in there you would just select the epic that you just created, and then that will make everything roll up to the epic. If for whatever reason you need more linking, you can also go into stories, and it's either under the edit or the more menu. I think it's under the edit menu, where you can actually go in and link other JIRA issues to it. So you can go in and link to an epic without putting the epic in the epic field, but you lose the hierarchy if you do that. So that's how you would connect a bunch of different tasks and stories to an epic, is using that epic link.
And I'm wondering too if there's another question here, because when I heard it, I've seen people have different motivations or reasons for doing this. And another idea that comes to mind is to use components maybe instead of epics. Like maybe you want to track all the UI work, so you can charge the UI, budget, and you want to track all the database hours, so you can track the database budget. Well, JIRA has these things called components, and you can, when you set up a user story or task, I believe you can specify that it's for a particular component.
Yep.
And then you can do some component level reporting and say, well, what are all the tasks that were related to database? That kind of stuff. Yep. So that might be another,
Yeah, that's great. And component is actually something that's out of the box on JIRA. So if you don't see it as a field in your edit menu, or whatever your most expanded one is, talk to your JIRA admin, because I just have to turn it on for you.
All right, and we have a question from Sheila, which I think is going to be a great way to wrap up this particular topic. So last one. And Sheila asks, how frequently should reports be evaluated? I was recently in an organization where management seemed to monitor reports several times a day. That felt like an impediment in itself, but I'd like others' opinions.
Well, yeah, again, it's one of those, it depends. If what you're doing requires being monitored several times a day, by all means. The idea is to reduce the overhead for that. So if you have a dashboard, or you have something that whoever wants to monitor it can monitor it as often as they like, but it requires no overhead on your part, as long as you're not having to complete the report several times a day, that's great. I mean, anytime you can get your reports into a pull situation, however over the top they want to be on their monitoring, they're welcome to do it, because it creates no overhead for you. And it kind of also depends on what they're monitoring for the day. If that's not an appropriate time frame for progress, then it doesn't make sense, right? But yeah, so I would just say, having it on somewhere where whoever it is can just pull the information whenever they want to. That's the easiest way to do it, to reduce the overhead. But at the same time, we've got to make sure that the time scale for that is appropriate to the time scale of how you could actually expect to see progress on something.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for your time presenting today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. One more time, send your questions to Lisa on LinkedIn or info@lightspeed.com. And we will have another webinar coming up next month. So keep an eye out, and we hope you'll join us again.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks, Lisa. Bye, Roland. Bye, Lisa.
Bye.
Have a great day.